Do you want to leave the door? I close the door. Okay, I think we're ready to start. Hi, come in. Hi, hello everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'm Jo Paul, one of the co-hosts of this classical reception seminar series, along with my colleague Emma from here at the Institute. And we're really delighted to have got this up and running this year. This is our second seminar in a series of 7, I think. And there are programmes around the table if anyone needs reference to what's coming up in the next few weeks, but we will give you a reminder as well before we finish today. Okay, so we are absolutely delighted today to have Professor Lorna Hardwick as our second speaker. So I don't think Lorna does require much by way of an introduction, but I'll give her a brief one anyway. As I'm sure most of you know, Lorna is really one of our founding foremothers of classical reception studies as a founder member of the Classical Reception Studies Network, an editor of the wonderful OBP reception series, Classical Presences, and as an author and editor of many books that we all probably use on a very regular basis, from the new surveys book on reception studies to edited collections on all aspects of the field, looking at post-colonial receptions, studies of translation, and many more besides. Lorna's now a Professor Emerita at the Open University, but I know is still very, very active and busy with lots of ongoing projects, a couple of which I'll just mention briefly. Lorna's heading up a really fascinating sounding project on classics and poetry now, which she's described to me as an example of what is called slow research. And I'm probably not the best person to explain what that is, but perhaps that will come up in the course of your talk or in questions later on. And also a new project where she's working with Stephen Harrison and Elizabeth Vandiver, trying to get off the ground a really exciting sounding series of new digital commentaries, beginning with a project looking at receptions of World War I poetry, receptions of classical texts in a range of World War I poetry. But today, Lorna is going to be talking to us on the subject of scholarship as reception, horizons and aspirations. Thank you, Lorna.
Thank you very much, Jo. Wonderful to be here in the room with the painted ceiling. I have sat and snoozed many times over the last 30 years or so. Now, I'm very grateful to the CRSN and especially to Emma and Jo for setting up this seminar series, and also to the ICS and its director, Professor Greg Wolfe, for hosting it. Before I kick off with the paper, I'd just like to make a brief personal statement on University of London and outsourced working. Most of you will know that there's been considerable concern about the University of London's policies on outsourcing working. The Vice-Chancellor of the University of London has issued a statement recognising the duty of care owed to all workers and giving assurances about progress in bringing all workers in-house, ensuring payment of the London living wage and ending the use of 0 hours contracts. And so it's on the basis of that assurance and that his timetable for implementation, and also because the CRSN is a freestanding network, that I felt able to go ahead with my contribution to this seminar series. I'd like to reiterate my personal commitment to the collegiality and fair treatment of all workers in higher education, including support and ancillary workers. I've noted that the University of London Vice-Chancellor has put it on public record that he accepts, quote, academic labour cannot be isolated from other forms of work underpinning it, end of quote. Thank you very much. Now to my paper. This represents a window into two aspects of current development in classical reception research and teaching that have been engaging me a lot recently. It's necessarily skeletal, and I hope you'll bear with me on that. The aim is to throw out a few ideas that you can take up. I hope that discussion afterwards, both today and in the future, will help to refine the issues that I'm just tentatively grappling with today. Needless to say, when I refer to text, the term includes all aspects of culture, literary material, visual, performative, etc. Paper today is in two parts. In the first part, I'll try to open a window on some of the developing requirements of reception scholarship, and by implication then of reception teaching. I'll refer briefly to the multiplicity of demands on scholars and students, and to the layering of the core work to date. I'll then identify some additional concepts approaches that are needed to respond to current trends and to the new and different types of evidence that's becoming available. I'll aim to note especially what is involved in transmission, including not only translation, which, as you know, I've worked quite a lot on, but also increasingly important aspects, such as theories of translocation and transfer. The map is changing in tracking how texts, images, ideas of Greece and Rome are moving into current cultural contexts, and how they are perceived by practitioners and scholars, as well as in the public imagination. And classical reception theory and practice of the future has to engage with this, as well as continuing to do all the things that it already has been doing so well. If you think, for instance, the amount of work that goes into a particular case study, absolutely essential before it's even possible to envisage a bigger picture. Then in the second part of my paper, I want to comment briefly on the status of scholarship and its histories as itself reception, agents of reception, as well as a commentariat. The importance of this resonates not only for classics and classical reception, but also for wider issues of cultural history and its selections, repressions, and for how the past is evaluated in its various presents, including our own, how cultural memory is constructed and critiqued. So the two parts of the paper, I hope, will speak to one another in the sense that they will just open up possible dialogue. My concluding section is the aspirational one. It relates to both of those hotspots, to aspirations for the future of classical scholarship and its contributions to human understanding of past, present, and future, about which I think we can often be a lot more bullish than we have been. So let's start by looking at where, very roughly, we are now. If we were mapping what classical reception analysis involves, what would be the key points? I'll mention these in sequence, but actually, as you know, there are many points of entry into this particular web. Firstly then, the ancient texts, as the ancient authors and spectators, readers, viewers experienced and perceived them. This is, if you like, the traditional focus of classical scholarship, and it is vital and continues to be vital for classical reception, research and teaching. It's one very important reason why those working within antiquity and those whose work has a later focus must listen and talk to one another. Secondly, the ancient text as subsequent authors experienced and perceived them. By authors, I mean creative practitioners of various kinds. How they perceived them within antiquity and since then. This involves a number of lenses, a number of entry points. For example, the lenses of classical education, which shape not only how the texts are encountered, but also the frameworks within which they are understood. To give just a very recent example, it's often said that the last generation of classically educated poets in Britain was the generation of Ted Hughes, Seamus Heaney, Tony Harrison. But I think that, although important, actually prompts us to look back in earlier years, earlier centuries, for similar balances and imbalances. For example, in World War I poetry that I'm working on at the moment, there are big differences between, for instance, Wilfred Owen, Isaac Rosenberg, and Sorley in the way in which they encounter classical texts, the extent, if any, to which they knew the ancient languages, the way in which they used translation, the way in which they met classical material via intervening traditions. So we have then the lenses of literary traditions within which creative writers and artists engage with Greece and Rome. The lenses of public imagination, because they are also members of the public, which is in its turn divided into, various cultural groupings, often with crossovers. Mediations, literary and media, from visual culture to film, dance, performing arts of various kinds. And these whole processes involve accretions, things that have latched on to ancient texts and ideas, marginalizations, where things are being pushed to the side, and maybe repressions and suppressions, where they've been pushed off completely or are just bypassed. And then, of course, there are the contexts of production, publishing, target readers and spectators, and so on. Now, as if these first two sort of sections, which the reception scholars got to be familiar with, were not enough, is then a third. Ancient and modern texts as modern readers, listeners, spectators experiences them. This layer builds on the different lenses I've mentioned and develops also additional features, such as increasing tracking and recognition of the ways in which text can be read forwards and backwards. For example, reading Derek Walcott through Homer and reading Homer through Walcott. There are also additional sources that shed light on different kinds of agency. Authors, readers, patrons. I call these the paramaterial, the perimaterial, depending on how you read your Jeanette. And they require different skills from the researcher in archive work, in detective work, in interpretation, comparison, and so on. Good examples are authors' prefaces, translators' introductions. In the context of modern receptions, there are also interviews and other published sources. There are various degrees of self-reflexivity that are involved, and those need to be considered alongside our mining of the texts themselves. Taken together, they feed into analysis of agency, covert as well as overt. The para and perimaterial complements authorial voice interventions and signatures in the text themselves. There's an example, for instance, in the way in which Michael Longley introduces an in-text comment in his poem, A Poppy, published in 2000, on how he and Virgil steal from Homer rather than simply imitate him. It's a very sophisticated intervention by Longley, because he both aligns himself, with Virgil, and also points to the slipperiness of the way in which that material is addressed. His aside aligns in readers' consciousness, passage in Aeneid Book 9, one in Iliad Book 8, modern soldiers, and the Irish rural poetic tradition. It also emphasises the agency and the originality of the new writer. There's more to come. The fourth area that reception scholars have to address: ancient and modern texts and their reception as scholars and other critics perceive them. So all the above categories that I've discussed are still in play, but there are additional concepts and tools needed to complement the traditional concepts of allusion and intertextuality. Reception, research and teaching recognises not only the craft of the writer, but also the various entry points of the reader. And tracking those links involves understanding of associations, affiliations, generic enrichment, which is in itself a source of what has been described as the overflow of potential meaning. Then there is glancing, haunting, ghosting, cognitive and affective poetics. I can go on, and you will all have your own categories that you've developed in the context of your own work. And all of those concepts reflect understanding that multiple meanings can be unlocked in the future, and that in the past, people, practitioners, readers, listeners have actually accessed the material in different ways. Now, some of these multiple meanings coexist with each other, and others shove alternatives out of the way. You know, there is a limit to the amount of nuanced balancing that you can actually do. And it isn't, by the way, when I point to multiple meanings, a case of anything goes, but of exploration of the interplay of text, form, context, and conceptual filters in particular times and places, and in response to the questions that we as scholars and as students want to ask of them. These processes and shifts over time and between places are a main concern of reception scholarship. It's been well said that poetry has meanings that hang between the words and the gaps between the words, and that's true of other media, I think, too. The potential overflow of meaning is disciplined by the particular aesthetic and judged and communicated both through creative representation and through scholarship. And at this point, I want to point to one particular reconceptualized development in scholarship that I think is particularly important for classical reception research and teaching, and that's transmission. This has been very much problematized in interesting recent work. It covers a number of aspects, including but not confined to translation. As far as translation is concerned, Emily Wilson's translator's note to her recent translation of the Odyssey comments on how translation is always an entirely different text from the source text, in that it always necessarily involves interpretation and decisions about how to communicate the formal elements of the source text in a different language and idiom. However, translation is only one possible thread in how antiquity passes into subsequent consciousness. Transmission covers the whole spectrum of how something from one culture is passed to another, whether by imitation or some other means. Modern meme theory has investigated one aspect of this, how an image, video, or piece of text may be copied and spread rapidly by internet users, for instance, often with slight variations, and often with the effect of creating a new image or even a brand. The transmission with variations of a cultural artifact from one culture to another, from one time to another, is what happens to texts, images, and ideas from antiquity. The repetition with a difference can be metrical, formal, metaphorical, translational, and transpositional. How the new constituencies of listeners, readers, spectators are positioned to experience this is a significant aspect of classical and classical reception analysis. I'll return to theoretical aspects of this later. But first of all, I want to take a brief look at how one group of ancient authors positioned their audiences, with implications for subsequent receptions. I'm going to turn the focus back on the Greek playwrights and point to some of the ways in which the ancient dramatists opened up possibilities for their audiences, the internal audience on the stage, as well as the external audience in the theatre. This is an important aspect of the ancient plays as themselves reception texts, for example, in their reception of myth and its use in ways that enrich both appreciation of the myths themselves and the development of the dramatic forms, an early example of generic enrichment, perhaps. Transmission of the myth involved both selection and repetition with a difference, and subsequent receptions build on or adapt many of the techniques deployed by the ancient writers. Now, to comment on the interplay between cultural context and expectations, and the specific shaping by the dramatists of the spectating experience of the ancient audiences, and by extension of the modern, I'd like to test out a rather unexpected framing concept, and that is nudging. What do I mean by nudging? If you've encountered the term nudging, it's probably in a very different context from that of Greek drama. The concept is found in behavioral science, political theory, and behavior economics, and is frequently theorized using models derived from psychology. At their simplest, nudge models describe systems of positive reinforcement and indirect suggestion, suggestions that are intended to influence the decision-making, behavior, and actions of groups and individuals. The term nudge is now applied to a wide range of contexts and issues. The best known specific example of a nudge situation is probably that of the fly etched in men's urinals with the aim of encouraging accurate aim. However, nudge practice has also migrated to politics with the aim of promoting compliance without enforcement, either because enforcement is not plausible, for example, in terms of resources or democratic and civic values, or because the point of the exercise is that the subjects must not be aware that they are being nudged in a particular direction. So that's covert nudging, if you like. The best known theorization of nudge is probably in Thater and Sunstein's book, Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth and Happiness, published in 2008. And you will readily be able to relate that to various public policies on mindfulness, well-being, etc. Now, these authors coined two terms that have stuck with the concept of nudging. The first is libertarian paternalism, which implies both the liberty not to do what one is being nudged towards and the assumption that those who know best are actually nudging one in a good direction. Hold this in mind when, for the second part of the paper, I move to discussing scholarship. The second term that the nudge philosophers coined, and the one that's most important for my argument today, is choice architecture. In that scenario, nudgers are the architects of choice. That is, they design and populate spaces that frame what people may choose to do. That kind of architecture is readily applicable to the formal structure of plays, as well as to the physical environment in which spectators find themselves. It subtly takes over what people experience and how they respond to it, and relates that to their own future decisions and what they do. Critique of nudge theory and practice says that nudge is a euphemism for psychological manipulation. Critics make the point that nudging can be short-term in its effects and that it diminishes autonomy. Both those observations are germane to theatre experience. The communality of the audience is short-lived, as Erika Fischer-Lichter has pointed out, and the spectators may have their better judgment overruled by crowd emotions and the physical and psychological intensity of the performance, as Thucydides explored in the Mitylene debate. That said, I would want to make a distinction, following Fischer-Lichter, between performance and spectacle. Spectacle is perhaps the more subject to manipulation in public arenas. I mean, Mussolini, Greek colonels, Stalinists, etc. Whereas performance implies, as I hope to show by analysing the formal elements, a much greater degree of toing and froing, of dialogue and questioning. But I hope that I've said sufficient about nudge theory at this stage to be able to make the transition into the architecture of performance. That is, the formal structures of Greek tragedy, and to comment on how those theatrical norms are used by the dramatists both to position and inform the spectators at the start of the plays, to situate them within the narrative, and to increase the spectators' awareness of the choices, political and moral, that are embedded in the development of the drama. The tragedians were selecting from and reworking myths, with a few extant exceptions, such as Aeschylus' Persians. In working with myth, the dramatists had to situate their audiences within the narrative because the myths were flexible, with many side branches, and sometimes had local resonances as well as wider Hellenic ones. In so doing, the dramatists also infused the narratives with the tone and the perspectives that they would play with in the rest of the action of the play. The main dramatic conventions used for this are the prologue or analogous scene setting, such as the nurse's opening speech in Euripides' Medea, the chorus, including the forms of the parados and the lyrics, as well as the participation of the chorus in questioning the protagonist and commenting on the action, the messenger speech and its affiliates, the agon, the rhesus. A rich source of examples is in Aeschylus' play Agamemnon, the first play in the Oresteia trilogy. And I put one example on your handout. It's example 1. Watchman opens the play, bringing together the backstories of the fall of Troy and the long-awaited return of the Greeks under Agamemnon to Argos, which in his absence has been governed by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus. This is a famous speech, and rightly so. It's full of dense suggestions and allusions, and sets up the action of the play by alerting the spectators and developing their sensibilities. Aeschylus uses the figure of the watchman to emphasize Clytemnestra's masculine qualities and to foreshadow uneasily the catastrophe that will ensue when Agamemnon returns. He also introduces the theme of silence and the theme of repression of knowledge about the past. This will gradually be revealed as the play progresses. Then the chorus fills in more of the backstory, events that detract from what might otherwise have been Agamemnon's triumphant return. The chorus sing what is virtually a lament about the death of Iphigenia, daughter of Clytemnestra and Agamemnon, who was sacrificed at Aulis on the way to Troy because the fleet was becalmed and Agamemnon's position was under threat unless he could placate the gods and ensure a fair wind for Troy, to which one might add also placating those who were opposed to him among his own troops. And there's an example from that, which is number 2 on your handout. The chorus describes Iphigenia, her prayers, her cries of father, her innocent youth. The leaders intent on war, valued at nothing. After a prayer, her father told his attendants to lift her like a goat, and so on. Again, it's a very famous passage. I won't read it all. This picture in words needs no exegesis. Interestingly, in some modern productions of Aeschylus' Oresteia trilogy, Euripides' play Iphigenia to Aulis has sometimes been staged at the beginning of the performance. For instance, by the influential French theatre director Ariane Mnouchkine for Les Atrides. The effect is to tighten the lens on Agamemnon's betrayal of his wife and daughter, and to set up some sympathy for Clytemnestra's subsequent murder of her husband in the bath that she is prepared to mark his return. My own view is that to play the Euripidean prelude is unnecessary, even perhaps de trop, as the chorus in the Agamemnon both provide the story and raise the emotional reactions of the audiences, internal and external, to the action. The language in which the chorus pictures the sacrifice of the girl is taken up by Clytemnestra at the end of the play, as she gives what is virtually a messenger speech to recount the killing of Agamemnon, which takes place off stage. Her speech sets out reasons, intellectual and emotional, for reversing judgments about Agamemnon and his entitlement, and plays on the Homeric epithet given to him as shepherd of the people. It is this architecture of performance through the play that is used by Greek tragedians and reused and reimagined in modern performance and adaptation to situate new generations of spectators into the narrative and the challenge, and to develop their critical responses. Thus, the tragedians set up a relationship with the ancient audiences that communicated to the spectators at the beginning of the play not only the point in the narrative from which the play would take off, but also its direction and tone, the points of tension, the emotions and events that will be crucial. This was not done in a didactic way, but through nuanced words and foreshadowing. The spectators might know in advance what the outcome of the story would be, but the dramatic force lay in how this would come about. This makes the formal elements, the architecture of the plays, vital. Prologue, chorus, agon, messenger speech, All are vehicles for developing the dynamics of understanding for both the internal and the external audiences. This combination of theatre conventions offers us a plurality of perspectives in the sense that there are different viewpoints and experiences, and that one event can touch people in different ways. It's the capacity of Greek tragedy to do this that underlies why and how it's continued to speak to people across time, place, and language. Sociologists of tragedy have rightly pointed out that it gives voices to groups who might not have had a hearing in ancient society: women, slaves, the victims of war. This is important as an index of how tragedy could act as a countertext to dominant social views. However, it seems to me there is also a deeper plurality, a dense dynamic. John Hesk has discussed the limits of a directly didactic interpretation of tragedy. And I've put a short extract on one piece of his writing as extract 3 on your handout. He wrote, "If you want your Greek tragedy to be politically didactic for its original Athenian audience, you have to accept that its lessons, if indeed they can be so simplistically described, took the form of open-ended social and ethical problems rather than pat solutions. This is to accept a more complex model in which tragedy confronts, questions, and only very occasionally affirms the social, moral, political, and ideological discourses of its audience." The text and dramatic structures of the play do not point us to one interpretation. They offer spectators and readers insights into why Medea, Creon, the Greeks who killed Astyanax did what they did, and you can add your own examples. Not only why they did what they did, but how others perceived it. The plays offer a means of understanding a situation, its hinterland, and its impact in the present and the future. This architecture of choice in the plays, which the dramatists deploy to nudge internal and external audiences into extending their horizons, is carried over in transmissions, whether through ancient language performance, translations, or adaptations. And that provides just one of the very many threads that I tried to sketch out at the beginning about what is involved in classical reception research. This brings me to the second part of my exploration today, the nature of scholarship and its effects. This part of my paper is part of a larger project in which I plan to investigate some of the influential models and practices in classical scholarship, identifying and analysing systemic assumptions, paradoxes, and shifts in values, epistemology, and practice. We're picking up what I sketched out in the first part of the discussion about transmission of knowledge, of practice, of values. And I hope that in due course it will make a contribution to the area identified by Christopher Stray as needing considerable further attention. And there's an extract of Chris's views, extract 4 on your handout. He wrote, "The part played in the transmission of classical culture by scholarship and teaching, which is but rarely reflected in the pages of the journals and monographs devoted to classical reception studies." Very true. At a conference last autumn to mark Chris Stray's achievements, I explored some aspects of this, and I'll be writing that paper up for publication. And I'm trying to avoid too much repetition and overlap that here. But the central sort of, core aim is the one that he's identified. There's need for an extensive study of the theory and practice of knowledge transmission-based approaches to classical scholarship and classical reception. Here, I want to just comment on one aspect, the issues that problematize what might be called identity scholarship. Look at some recent debates is salutary. There's been a certain amount of reflection on the perspectives that frame scholarly inquiry. on the types of authority that they imply and the debates that they provoke, not least in the analysis and interpretation of the ancient texts, as well as their modern analogues. And I've indicated already that I see those two aspects as very much in dialogue. Perspectives of gender, sexuality, ethnicity, class, physical and mental conditions infuse critical thinking. Yet there is a major leap from the recognition of those perspectives and the experiences underlying them as starting points for the questions we might choose to ask of the sources, and the key questions about how can this be done and what difference is then made. Does, for example, the admission of female scholars into academia actually lead to different kinds of scholarship? In other words, is it the personnel and the agenda which change, or the substance of the discipline? Is study of antiquity changing continually, or are the new voices admitted into what might be called a closed project? Now, how can the study of the history of scholarship help with these questions? Some of these issues are challenging for classicists, especially when the subject area as a whole is not well understood outside the academy, and many classicists, for quite understandable reasons, often feel quite beleaguered because of social stereotyping, intellectual stereotyping, and so on. But I would argue that apologia and recusatio are companions rather than polarities. And furthermore, that it is possible to reflect without descending into navel gazing or being consumed by guilt. My interest in identity scholarship has been further provoked by two areas of current debate. The first is the broad one of identity politics, and the second relates to issues in our own profession. Identity politics has become a shorthand term that masks a complex interrelationship of different things. There's potentially a tension between the value of the voice of lived experience and the sense that it is only people who are in a particular situation that have the right or duty or necessary insight to speak about it, which would very much limit the number of things that we could actually speak about collectively in the public realm. I mention these tensions because it seems to me that they provide some analogies with problems affecting our own communities of classical scholars. In the area of classics itself, there has been a forceful debate, including recent email exchanges between practitioners working in the field. This email discussion was initiated by Nathaniel, who's kindly given me permission to quote from his comments. In brief, he reflected on the history of how antiquity had been appropriated by scholarship, and through scholarship integrated into the public imagination to create, underpin and sustain the association between Greek and Roman antiquity and the validation, even vindication, of colonialism and racism. And to that, I would add embedding of misogyny and of distinctions between worthy democracy, i.e. voting on systems established by and dominated by an elite, and threatening democracy, i.e. the mob liable to manipulation, distinctions found in Thucydides and absorbed into subsequent political theory and beyond, you may well think. Nathaniel also stated his view in a subsequent email to me that in spite of having been admitted to the exclusive Society of Oxford, gaining a double first in Greats, followed by a PhD at Michigan, and taking a prominent part in classical activities, he was nevertheless racialized as a black person and felt powerless to change the prevailing ethos and practice in the field. As a result of his doubts, he took a gloomy view of the future of ancient Greece and Rome as a subject of study, other than for a small antiquarian residue who might claim its lack of utility as a virtue. Now, those are hard words. And I've tried to persuade him that there is an alternative future for classics, while not denying the validity of his own experiences and his concerns. His intervention compelled me to take a look at the underlying implications. Firstly, the question of the norms associated with the identity of the scholarly community in classics. Secondly, how to construct and communicate a scholarship that neither represses nor privileges strands that contend with one another, including those which some might sometimes wish were not there, but which are both part of its history, and the term classical is itself problematic, as everybody knows. In talking about the identity of the community of classical scholars, senior, junior, and students, I stress that I'm not here talking about statistics or the composition of the community or its demographics, nor about the persisting problems of access, important though all of those are. I'm talking about what it is that people aspire to get and become when they join the classical community. The values and practices that are learned, taught, critiqued, and adapted, and how those constrain, enhance, or shape the senses of identity of the individual members and subgroups, and by extension, their relationship with wider society. I've already made clear my view that having any particular cultural identity may be a starting point, but is by no means a sine qua non for speaking on problems of exclusion, oppression, or limitation of academic aspiration. I mean, for the record, as those of you who are here can see, I'm female, white, no longer young, and probably assimilated to whatever kinds of middle-class label are now attached to academics. But that doesn't absolve me from trying to think outside that particular box. Considerable research has been done in recent years on questions of identity. In referring to identity scholarship, I don't mean the scholarly investigation of issues of identity, but rather scholarship that is informed and shaped, wittingly or unwittingly, overtly or covertly, by the identity or identities of the teacher or researcher, or which is regarded as such and evaluated accordingly, which can have positive or negative results. And there is the group identity of what we increasingly refer to as the classics community. To investigate trends for classics, it's helpful to look not just at the work done on cultural and political identity by critics such as Stuart Hall and Kwame Anthony Appiah, revealing though that is, but also to consider analyses that have been made of organisations as sites of identity. Here I draw on Andrew Brown's discussions, one of which was published in the international journal devoted to management. Brown uses a working definition of identities as, I quote, people's constructively construed understanding of who they were, are, and desire to become. He also identifies 5 interconnected debates in contemporary identity research, centred on notions of choice, stability, coherence, positivity, and authenticity. Positivity, I think, is something that probably needs a little bit of critiquing. The sense in which I'm wanting to use it, as you'll see later, is very much geared to aspirations rather than to closing ranks. Classical scholarship is sometimes defined by a strong sense of shared scholarly values and community. This also has to accommodate and indeed encourage debates, challenges, difference. But can the famed intellectual diversity of the classical or any other scholarly community actually be somewhat cosmetic? There is, a certain cursus honorum, and it's not unknown for the academic res publica to mutate into imperium. Identity can be caught, it can also be imposed. Put bluntly, does acceptance, and acceptance by whom, into the company of professional scholars involve a smoothing out of other potentially overlapping identities that are part of the individual persona and of lived and inherited experiences? What difference is made when barriers to the profession of gender, race, sexuality, disability are dismantled or rendered negotiable? And how can the differences made to classical scholarship be identified and described? For example, tinkering with the curriculum, more variety in research topics and publication, in mainstream journals or in specialist journals, in non-classical journals. Is there any sign of development in theorising, generated by and tested by classics research, as opposed to being imported, often after a delay of some years, from other subject areas? And you may rightly say that I've just been doing it myself. Now, there are many double binds involved in trying to answer those questions. For instance, there's been distinguished work done in both teaching and research to retrieve female classicists from the historical limbo into which many of them had been consigned. Female scholars have been appointed to senior positions. Yet to ask whether the theory and practice of scholarship itself has been changed by this risks, on the one hand, falling into the trap of essentialism, i.e. assuming that women think and work in particular ways precisely because they are women, and so on, Velsim, in terms of race and ethnicity. The trap, on the other hand, is equally awkward. If the norms and aspirations of scholarship remain unchanged, it can be said that the new entrants, for want of a better word, have been normalized into the predominantly white patriarchy that set and developed those scholarly practices and criteria, which have been transmitted, in my sense of the word, to teaching, publication, and disseminated into the wider community. Now, there are some insights to be found in current projects generated by neighbouring subject areas. For example, Professor Mona Baker, the leading translation studies teacher and researcher, heads an international project called the Genealogies of Knowledge, which has implications not just for how scholarship itself is framed and transmitted, but also for how scholars operate in the wider public domain. I hesitate to use the term public intellectual, but it has been and still is a significant term for classicists. The Genealogies Project is hosting a conference in Manchester in 2019, which will, inter alia, challenge Edward Said's ideal of the public intellectual as a beacon of fiercely independent incorruptibility and an expression of the norms of liberal democracy, and will instead examine his view as a product of its place and time. There are bound to be implications for the corresponding myth or mantra of the classical scholar as embodying qualities of rational independence and authority that can be transmitted from generation to generation. And the keynote speaker at this conference will be Christopher Stray on the politics of the classical language and authority in the 19th century, which is yet another example of the way in which classicists can actually lend a certain kind of critical distance to current debates that is obviously quite helpful. Sometimes looking outside our own immediate intellectual environment aids clarity. Chris Stray's work has raised questions about the extent to which admission into classical scholarship involves admission into shared codes. Shared codes can imply something that could be described as classical values, as well as pointing to methods of categorizing and interrogating sources, and the criteria for making judgments in response to specific questions that are part of the fabric of most disciplines. It can also involve situating readers and students and providing an architecture, material and intellectual, that nudges them into responses and attitudes that transmit and normalize assumptions and worldviews, which make them into starting points and frames for the next succession of inquiries. Reception studies and history of scholarship can work together to track and map these aspects, the context in which they grew and operated, and their subsequent effects. In so doing, it can also provide models that are helpful to current inquiry into the social and economic histories that have shaped cultural memory, the development of institutions, the architecture and material features of public spaces, and so on. Finally then, aspirations. Classics and classical reception scholars, practitioners, and readers, spectators constitute a forum for identifying and addressing controversial issues and troubling questions that might otherwise be ignored, marginalized, left to competing rhetorics, or be part of the culture of denial. For example, classical scholarship has long had to confront the fact that its highly valued and loved texts and histories are the products of slave societies, imperial regimes, misogynistic cultures and social practices, and values that had war and conflict at their heart, and that's just the beginning. Furthermore, the history of scholarship provides evidence for ways in which successive societies were or were made complicit with such values, as well as for ways in which they challenged or resisted them. Understanding why people thought and acted as they did brings context and value judgments into dialogue, and can support aspirations for a better future without repressing or sanitising the past. I'm always reluctant to give classical studies or classical reception studies the status of exceptionalism, with all those accretions of authority and dominant ideology, but I do use the term distinctive. Classical studies, in its myriad forms, does offer a distinctive way of getting inside the intellectual and emotional density of human behaviour. And also, because antiquity is a different country, a means of enabling people to use that distance to develop critical perspectives, which can then be refined when they are analysing societies and practices that are nearer home. These can be deployed with advantage in the context of the immediate past, as well as the remote past, the present, and the future. To analyse and reflect on the history of classical receptions and classical scholarship without either sanitising or demonising the field is quite hard to do, and has to be subject to constant scrutiny and re-evaluation. The process also provides useful insights, even models, for a modern society that has to recognise and come to terms with its past, of which Greece and Rome is just one aspect. In pointing to this wider social and ethical value attached to classical reception scholarship, I'm not, I hope, taking the slippery slope towards exceptionalism, but instead pointing to the distinctive contribution that can be made by investigation of Greek and Roman texts and societies, and their migration into and adaptation by different kinds of cultural groups. After all, examination of our own histories is a necessary condition for investigating those of others. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Lorna, for a wonderfully wide-ranging paper. Just before we open up to the room for questions, we're just going to say goodbye to the people who are listening via the live stream here. Because obviously they might have questions and we don't have all your consent to record.